401. Today, September 30th, we are 401 days away from the 2024 presidential election. This will undoubtedly be a significant day for our nation. It'll serve as a reference point for the direction the United States wishes to take. As part of Gen Z, my peers and I have been inundated with the importance of getting out the vote for as long as I can remember. Like many young people involved in advocacy today, my work has centered around making voting accessible. And I believe strongly that voting is an incredibly important part of pursuing national change. That being said, in recent years, more and more debate has risen concerning the prioritization of voting over other forms of advocacy. Many of us are asking, is this the definitive solution? Especially considering the fact that voting is inaccessible to many and it is propped up on a fundamentally flawed system. We continue to see evidence of systemic voter suppression for Black Americans and other marginalized groups. The blatant inequity in voting access has left many people belonging to Gen Z to prioritize other forms of advocacy. Now, to be very clear, the purpose of this talk is to not dissuade eligible voters from the polls, but to rather highlight the incredible push we are seeing from Gen Z to organize in ways that don't solely center voting. Gen Z's models for advocacy reflect possibilities for large-scale political change beyond the frameworks we know, and I'm excited to share those with you today. Now, a couple of years ago, I had the privilege to spend my junior year and the summer leading up to the 2020 general election working for a school teacher of mine, Lucia Baez-Geller, who is now running to represent her District 3 constituents on the Miami-Dade County Public School Board, the third largest school district in the nation. During the time, I was exposed to the power of grassroots mobilizing, as many of the students and individuals helping her campaign were students and teachers like me who believed that they were going to be getting someone who would serve as the best advocate on the school board for them. Now, through a narrow victory in the primary election and a general election win, we were able to secure a seat at the table for now school board member Baez-Geller. At the time, this felt like a huge victory. It almost felt as if Miami-Dade County was about to change forever, all thanks to this newly elected representative. Now, don't get me wrong, school board member Baez-Geller's work has undoubtedly helped to further advocate support for students and teachers, as I had the honor of witnessing this past summer as her intern. Yet at the same time, I quickly learned there's still so much work to be done. Reflecting on my upbringing through the Miami-Dade County public school system, I noticed inequities in creating inclusive environments for students. For me, this looked like a lack of access to sexual education for same-sex relationships. I specifically remember asking my 8th grade biology teacher what to me seemed like a rather standard question. Do you have any guidance for students in same-sex relationships? Apparently, a loaded question. Her response, while sympathetic, deepened the faults that the existing legislative body had laid. The dissonance between state legislation and the desires of actual community members have made it incredibly clear to me that there is still tremendous work to be done. This disconnect between legislative bodies and the constituents they represent has helped mobilize and connect members of my generation. Now, a recurring theme in Gen Z mobilizing is interconnectedness. A prime example of this is a growing frustration experienced by Southern, and I mean this in a geographical sense, Gen Zers when it comes to the digital and physical interpretations of our states. We've been able to connect to one another due to such ineffectiveness. It has led Southerners and people in conservative states to be reduced to the elected officials that are meant to represent us. You see, this is a blind spot of prioritizing voting as the definitive mode for large-scale political organizing. With voting, there's this idea that people have total agency, that they've made their bed and now they must lie in it. This isn't fair, especially when you consider the flaws inherent in the voting system. Voter suppression, gerrymandering, inaccessible polling locations, and stricter voter ID laws are to name a few. Over the past few years, Florida public schools have been the topic of national debate. I've seen firsthand the role elected officials have had on passing legislation that targets students in the margins, particularly students of color, queer students, and disabled students. We've seen an onslaught of this legislation, whether it be HB 1557, the Parental Bill of Rights Act, or more commonly known as the Don't Say Gay Bill. This prohibits classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity, or the recent restrictions to advanced placement African American history or advanced placement psychology throughout the state. Such legislation has been disparaging, to say the least, and has undoubtedly challenged my prior belief that voting is the end-all, be-all. So, what makes my generation's approach to activism different? Simply put, it's the time in which we grew up. Gen Z spans from the late 1990s through the early 2010s. Throughout that time, many have grown up in a world that has seen mass social and political change while simultaneously seeing improvements in the way we connect virtually. Just within the past 5 years, our generation lived through and is still living through the COVID-19 global pandemic that is shifting now into its endemic stage. This was and still is an unprecedented time for members in my community. We re-examined many facets of our lives, and this prolonged period of isolation gave many the opportunity to take a step back and reflect. Many current students on this campus were hit by the pandemic at a time in our lives when we were witnessing new experiences deemed the norm. My pre-pandemic world shut down on March 13th, 2020 with the closure of my high school. Those initial weeks and months would morph into a time of intense self-isolation and disconnection from the traditional teenage routine. Like many here, I avoided going outside, going to public places, and limiting my exposure to large-scale social gatherings to limit potential exposures. While my in-person social life changed, so did my relationship with the internet. What I was exposed to in the coming months was an increased reliance on my social network, now through the confines of a digital lens. I'd been used to keeping in contact with family overseas, so this form of building communication wasn't abnormal to me, but yet a lot changed. Prior to the pandemic, most people only engaged with issues specific to their in-person communities. While people still often educated themselves on several global issues, it was much more easier to focus your energy entirely on in-person action. As the COVID-19 shutdowns of 2020 forced in-person communities to find one another online, advocacy movements began building international roots of change, moving beyond the communities directly around us. This disconnect from our physical spaces and the growing reliance on digital ones is where me and other people within my generation first started our activism work. Now, even prior to the pandemic, Gen Z had been at the forefront of mass mobilizing efforts. In the wake of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas school shooting in February of 2018, we saw an influx of students advocating for an issue impacting us all, the lack of regulation on firearms. Similarly, students, especially in South Florida, have also organized to fight for climate change in the face of legislators and elected officials denying climate change's effects. Over and over, we see this continual push to target large-scale issues by our generation throughout the past years. This shift to digital activism has allowed us to connect in ways we haven't before, and our activism has become much more focused on interconnected issues that aren't just relegated to specific cities and communities. Additionally, it's important to emphasize that because of this shift to a more decentralized activism, we've prioritized finding strategies to address specific manifestations of international issues, working to build community outside of the strategies we've been taught. Now, a significant part of learning more about others' experiences is identifying the ways in which our lives differ from another's and what privileges we hold. As somebody who holds both over and underrepresented identities, it's important to emphasize that my lived experience should not serve as the definitive definition of how Gen Z mobilizes. I've approached my work in education and voting activism from the lens of a white, queer, cis man. It's important to take a step back and to recognize the privileges that are afforded to me. So when I found out I had the opportunity to speak with you all today, I wanted to make sure I would highlight the ways Gen Z organizes that have inspired me. I'll go about this by highlighting two key themes central to Gen Z's approach to organizing, is relying on one's social network. One example of this is the push to establish community fridges to curb food insecurity, as this is a truly community-driven model of advocacy. Another model for Gen Z organizing is the use of mutual aid. Peers lean on one each other for financial support to minimize the income gap. These two both tie into this larger scale idea of leaning on one each other for interconnectedness when it comes to Gen Z mobilizing. So, back to South Florida. What we saw on September 6, 2023 was an outpouring support for students and teachers to come and rally behind Bill H-11. This bill would recognize October as LGBTQ History Month. This legislation was deeply personal to me, not only as a queer individual who grew up in that school system, but as someone who helped develop this item for its third go-around the school board. Seeing the divisiveness of a purely ceremonial recognition frustrated me, yet it empowered me, and it continued to empower members of my generation. So what we witnessed on that day was an outpouring of youth showing up and making their voices heard. Although H-11 ultimately didn't pass, what we saw is a testament to the mobilizing work our generation does. An influx of students and concerned parents showed their support physically, but also virtually. Now, for context, a monthly school board meeting starts around 3 p.m. and runs till maybe 7, 8 p.m. However, votes for H-11 weren't even taken until 1 a.m. the following day on September 7th. It's important to note that because of extensive Get Out the Word campaigning disseminated throughout social media, constituents amplified their voices, helping shift support from this item from only 1 in support in 2022 to now 3 in support in 2023. Although this bill failed to pass, the voices of my generation were heard and will continue to be heard. So, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, is how Gen Z leans on our social networks. We work targeting issues within our community. We develop initiatives that are rooted in equity and that are tangible, and that are created outside the ballot box. Thank you.